everybody, welcome to my new channel series called Comic Shorthand. Not really my new channel, it's the new series. So this is episode 1. I came up with this idea, which is not very original. It's an idea I kind of have taken from everyone, but Jim Lee has said it before, and it's the idea that for every object in the real world, you can represent that best in some symbolic form on paper when you're drawing. So essentially that's what this whole channel is about, or this whole series. And you'll see as I go on what it really takes to find a quick and easy method to have a shorthand for things. So shorthand's kind of stolen as an expression from when you write down abbreviations for different words, you end up writing quicker. So just as it works for writing, you can do the same thing for art, and you'll end up just drawing quicker. And the quicker you draw, the quicker you get paid and able to make this into a career. So you need to make this into as much of a science as you can without making it boring and not fun. So we went through what shorthand really means. It means that you're trying to find a symbol, not in its truest form, but in the way you can replicate something, rather than just using a triangle to represent a nose. You don't want to go that far, but here we go. The first episode is kind of spawned from my work that I've been doing on Compromised, a story that Wes Locker, still don't know how to pronounce his name, you gotta ask him, but a story that he wrote, and I recently finished. It's up online, you can read it on my site or his, but it's a 3-page short story, and on the third page there's something that needs to be drawn on the wall to represent an old school TV, the ones that are square and maybe has an attached VHS player. For a lot of the younger listeners, you won't really recognize it, but back in the day there used to be these weird TVs that had tubes in the back and just a lot of external stuff. But either way, that was cased in this square looking plastic, and that's what TVs were back then. And that's what I need to put on this wall. So I looked up some reference, as you can see here, and it's just a little crappy photo from some hotel room, I'm sure, some Holiday Inn. But yeah, that's your first step. Your first step is to find some reference and step away from what you're doing, because this is how I usually do it, is as you're working you do a study. Instead of on Tuesday I'm going to do some studies for something. Instead of doing it that way where you set time aside, it's better just to do it as you're working, stop a little bit, and start working on analyzing and doing the study as you go. That way you're almost in the same workflow as implementing it. So you'll see, the first step is find this reference, which I did, and then your next step is pretty much to find 3 design elements that you can pull from the reference. And this is where Jim Lee has talked about it. It's because he goes around and he said that wherever he goes, he looks at different objects in the room or different people, and he pulls just 3 things from different objects to find the best way to represent them. So say a street lamp, you might think, rounded glass casing, and then find the proportions of the pole versus the hangover pole that's attached to it to make the L shape. Either way, that's just an example, but you need to find 3 things. And to do that, you just need to break it down. And that kind of is most of what I do in this video, is to try to break it down. I won't do this every time when I do an episode, because I think it'll go way quicker once you get the basics. I just want to show how I draw different things and name it something witty like Comic Shorthand. But here we go. So here I'm looking at the dimensions, like how, high and wide and long is the object. You need to get the proportions right, pretty much. So number one, find the shapes that match your proportions, and that's pretty much going to do half the battle for you. If you get the right proportions right, most people will start filling in the details in their head. So that's what I'm going to write here. We're going to put down shapes. There's different shapes to everything, and as you can see on this TV, it's pretty square, and you can see there's a good amount of thickness, and from the width of the desk it's sitting on, you can kind of see how far it goes back, because I know you can't see it from the front view, and you normally, if you've never seen one of these, you might have to find more reference to see a side view, but it goes really that deep. It's pretty deep, but this is generally how most of them look. It's like a really clunky, heavy piece of equipment. Next, as you see, I'm writing like, what are the edges like? Can you draw with just one sharp line the contours, or do you need to feather the lines, or on the interior lines when you're describing the lines that are not the silhouette lines? Can you leave those blank to show more curvature, or how much should you delineate the lines inside? And then after that, you can look at values. Pretty much how is the grayscale work on the object? So like this TV, it's very gradual. There's a lot of darks and a lot of lights, but it doesn't have hard highlights. It has a little bit of value that gets toward the higher end, but it's not shiny. So that's what you're kind of looking for. Look where your blacks are and look how gradual they go from black to white. Look at where reflections are and start studying, how bright and dark should you make your object look when you start drawing it. And that's what I mean by values, because when you draw in comics, you're not necessarily, depending on your style, you're not necessarily drawing all of the, every little piece of detail. So sometimes artists leave these up to interpretation for the colorist to implement, maybe the inker to add some more detail, but generally when you're studying, you want to get as much information as you can out of it. That way when you work, you end up having a good amount of training behind when you start implementing in your comics. So here I'm going to start drawing out on the object and trying to find, in this specific example, what are the answers I'm seeking. So I'm noticing that it's really bulky. You can tell it's super heavy. I don't know if you've ever, moved an old TV like this, but even the small ones are incredibly heavy. You're not having a good time lugging this thing around. Some of the newer TVs are pretty heavy too, but this one, even the small ones, are a pain. So here I'm blocking out the shape. I'm just using an outline, painting over in Photoshop, and seeing, all right, that's kind of what it looks like. And trying to remember in your mind the dimensions of this bounding box that you're setting up. You're trying to remember contours as I'm drawing it right here. You're seeing like, oh, the screen's a little bit curved, so the more you look at it from the side, the more you might see the curvature, especially in the boundary around the screen. And the silhouette is pretty important too, so as I'm going through, I'm kind of trying to keep in mind the silhouette. But I recommend this, like when you study, it's not just like trying to copy. If I drew this thing, got everything exactly right, try to make it super realistic, you might learn a little bit, but I think if you do something like this, you're learning more. You're gonna feel like you know the object a little better, even though you might be off here and there, but the more you look at it, the more you draw on it, the more you compare shapes and proportions to other proportions, the better you'll be at it. And that's the goal, just to do this every once in a while when you're not, especially when you're not familiar with the object you're about to draw. If you've drawn it a million times, you won't need to do this. And slowly your visual library with this stuff will get better and better. And a lot of times you won't even need to do this. You'll be like, cathode ray TV, I got that on lock. I don't need to look up reference almost. And that's how you can start getting quick. Aside from all the other things that make you go quicker when you draw, this is one of them. Alright, so I'm looking at the edges. I'm noticing the edges on the insides, especially that surround the front facing to the side panel, and all the panels that surround this box are not sharp. They're a little bit rounded. So that's what I'm noticing. I'm noticing that for the most part, there are soft edges, especially with this one. I think it reads a Philips. I think this is a Philips TV. So I'm noticing also that I label these things, that way I remember. When you write something down, you remember more about it. So I'm writing down where and labeling on the picture where things are. So on here, the TV is sharp around the screen. And you can see that there's a difference in how the lines work there. And now in this blue, I'm kind of trying to pick out where the darkest spots are, the blacks. I'm spotting my blacks. And I noticed there's some underneath this ledge at the base where that big blue mass I drew in there, and that's for the cast shadow. And then around the screen there's a little gap, and that's almost like an occlusion. Same thing with these little speaker vents on the left and right side of the buttons. So anywhere there's a cast shadow is going to be the darkest shadow, and anywhere there's like a good gap or occlusional shadows. I don't know if that's a word, but anywhere there's like a good gap, you're gonna get some heavy darks. And since this is not that reflective, and it's a pretty matte kind of plastic, you're not gonna get a lot of hard darks. It's gonna be pretty much like a grayish gradient all around. Anyway, here I'm noting that in the speakers, like I said, there's some black, and then this buffer bevel that surrounds the screen is going to have some black because there's a little bit of, like I said, of a gap between the plastic and the screen. So all these things need to be noted, marked down. Well, depending on how your mind works, because everybody thinks differently, you don't have to necessarily write this all down. For me, it works. I remember things better this way. When you kind of write it, draw it, and then make it as black and white, no pun intended, as possible. For me that works. Where, for this cathode ray TV, I know it's matte. It's got a little bit of shine to the screen. It's, I try to lock it down as much as I can. That way, there's no question when I go back to drawing. So, here I'm going to try to pull out where the highlights hit, and that all depends, obviously, on where the light is. But what I'm really looking at is how big and how concentrated and how high of a value are the highlights. And this is just further examining the material that it's made out of. And so I can tell it's pretty matte. You can see that highlight is like just a streak, nothing really high. It's not pure white. Even the highlight around the rim over there where I'm marking is not super bright. So it's this matte plastic. We know that, and I'm just further showing that, delineating it to myself and for you guys, and I think you get my point. Pretty sure I'm beating a dead horse with this one, but it's the first episode. I want to go into detail and make sure you guys get the basics of how I kind of do these kind of things. And like I said, I think it's super important to do these studies. It's the only way you're going to grow. You can do it on the side, like I was pointing out before. You can work on these, every Tuesday, work on anatomy, and every, Friday, work on drawing different objects that you're not familiar with. But I prefer you do this as you go, as you're working. Take a stop. It serves two purposes, really. You can stop, giving your eye a breather on the work that you're working on, and when you come back to it, you might see it differently, and it might help with you getting comfortable with your picture plane. And two, you can learn what you're talking about or what you're trying to draw and what you're trying to learn, and instead of doing it the other way where you're, it's almost like a separate thing. To me, doing it all in one as you're working just totally makes sense. So that's my route. And here I wrote down landmark cues, and I'm just trying to pretty much find the things that like really stand out, like things that are not necessarily shapes, but like here I'm circling the label on the front. So that's one thing. There's always going to be a label right below the TV usually. That's where they put them. Kind of like a car ornament, there's something on the front, toward the bottom, it's labeling it with the brand. So in your comics, you don't have to actually label it, but there needs to be some indication in your symbol of a TV that it has a label there. It's going to cue the reader in. Also for these old TVs, there's buttons in the center, or VHS tape at the bottom, and then speakers on the left and right. And that's what I'm marking here. Left and right speakers, because that's the best we got back in the 80s and 90s really. And then in the middle there's the power button, volume. I remember playing a lot of old games in front of this thing, all Super Nintendo and even the NES and everything on these type TVs. It's a lot of memories. And I think I'm at the point where once you find all the things that you've analyzed, you kind of, in your mind, think about all the little pieces, kind of put them together and kind of summarize what you've found. So we know that it's kind of square and bulky, and it's got these rounded edges. So how do I describe that? What is the best way to say these? And that way it's easy to remember for you, especially for next time, and you can save this out. That way you don't have to do it every time. You can always maybe look it up, but hopefully that's why you only pick 3 things, because you could come up with literally 100 things maybe about this thing if you want to get that specific. But that's why Jim Lee probably says 3, is because 3 is all you really need. I think as far as design goes, that's how Dave Raposa works too. He's a awesome artist that actually support on Patreon. He does this comic called Starvale, and he does a few other different things. He works for movies and does illustration, but he's an amazing artist. Either way, he designs the same way with 3 different design elements that he uses. He doesn't go past that, because once you go past 3, you're confusing the viewer, you're confusing yourself, and this is really all it takes to keep it simple. And simplicity usually sells the idea. So here we go. So 3 design elements, like I said, the bulky shapes and how it's proportioned is one thing. The first thing I'm writing here is that it's a matte black. And that pretty much tells me, by describing a matte black, depending on your experience in materials, matte black means there's not going to be strong highlights and there's not going to be strong darks. It's just going to be this mid-range that is covered. It's a lot of plastic wear and dull woods and stuff will have this matte kind of finish. Secondly, everything is rounded. Almost all the edges are rounded. It gives this kind of it's almost like a futuristic kind of feel without the tech. So it has this odd look to it. It's this purely 90s design where it's trying to be better than what it is. But yeah, it's essentially a rounded square, and that summarizes a lot of it because it's a very square object. And then I put down white logo and speakers, and those are pretty much the landmarks I'm pulling. So I think if you get these 3 things in to your design, as long as you get the basics of having a screen as well, because that's part of it. I didn't write that down, but I think that's self-explanatory. But as long as you get those 3 things, you're good to go. So after you finish all that, which shouldn't take you long, really. I'm taking the long route to explain it, but it shouldn't take you that long. After you do that, you want to implement it. And the implementation, should be pretty rough. You just want to get the idea across to yourself mainly. You want to give it some practice before you implement it. And I'm just going to let this video play out and speed it up. That way you can really get the feel of things and not have to watch me draw and make mistakes and whatnot. All right. As I'm finishing up here, because I'm pretty much done with it, I'm just cleaning things up. I had to make sure the proportions were kind of closer to right, and so I'm keep nitpicking it a little bit, but basically it's what I got, and I think it looks like it should, and when you put it into your comic, it'll be way easier and way quicker to do now that you've done this study, and that's the idea. So from here, you're going to take all the knowledge and jump back in your project and do something awesome with it. So I hope doing these types of videos will help everybody out. I'm going to do a lot more with it. And it won't nearly take as long as it did this time. This time I went through a lot of the prep work and explanation. I probably will go over it once or twice in the videos to come, but it'll be way quicker just to go through the steps, and I can even take recommendations or suggestions. So if you want to see a certain object done or a certain maybe feature on a figure, I prefer different objects and different environments, but even different features on the body. I can do a quick shorthand version of. Like I said, this is nothing new to anyone that does cartooning. It's pretty much the simplification process. I just wanted to break it down in my way and try to help and do my part helping on the YouTube communities. So thanks for joining me for this video, and I hope you stop by again. Thanks to everyone who's subscribed. Please like the video if you like it. Please subscribe if you like my channel. I'm planning to do a lot more of these. I've got a lot of footage already recorded. I'm just backlogged because I'm doing a lot of cool different samples for comics and a lot of different studies. So I'll be working on my dreams. You do the same, and I'll see you next time.